Hi, welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. What we're going to do today is take a little bit of a departure from our reading and rendering of Rollo May's The Discovery of Being and talk in some depth about the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard, who is a thinker that we mentioned in the very last video. Strategically, what I have in mind is this. I want to give you a little bit of time to get caught up on your reading assignment, so let's, at this juncture, give you a little bit of a rest from writing in parallel with the book and give you some more detail about Søren Kierkegaard, like I said, and that'll hopefully give you time to get caught up. All right, so Søren Kierkegaard, let's remember what we said about him in the last video when we were writing right in parallel with Rollo May's treatment. We talked about, I think the most important idea we talked about was Kierkegaard's distinction between two modes of truth. An objective mode of truth that is more or less based upon the idea of what is empirically demonstrable is true. Also, what is demonstrable in the domain of abstract disciplines like mathematics and formal logic is also true. That's objective truth, as opposed to subjective truth, which is the kind of truth that you have to experience firsthand as an individual for it to count as a truth at all. I gave you a couple examples of that. The first example, I guess, was the example of jazz. Like if you don't have at least a little bit of experience somehow to connect with what the truth of jazz is, then it's probably not going to appear to you to be a truth at all, a musical kind of truth. I also gave you another example drawn from Kierkegaard, which is the example of Christian faith. So from that point of view, Christian faith is not the product of any set of empirical observations or any sort of abstract logical argumentation that would seek to prove the existence of God, for instance. Rather, it's based upon a very personal kind of experience, and without at least some measure of that experience, the truth of Christian faith can't appear to you to be a truth at all. Okay, so that's all stuff from last time. Now, to launch into the new stuff, let's first get the crazy professor hair that keeps getting longer as a result of the coronavirus and the difficulty of finding barbers in the midst of the coronavirus. So let's get the professor hair under control slightly. A hat from Branson, Missouri. I took a trip out there with my father some decades ago, and interesting place, Branson, Missouri. Anyhow, let's get back to Kierkegaard. Okay, so there are his life dates. I gave them to you before, so 1813 to 1855. So we're talking about first half of the 19th century, toward the middle of the 19th century. Didn't live very long, 42 years. That's the same number of years that Elvis lived. There might be a connection there to Branson, Missouri. May the circle be unbroken. I'm not sure. At any rate, I want to talk today about a kind of developmental scheme proposed by Kierkegaard that has to do with how we move from one primary mode of existence to another primary mode of existence and possibly to yet another primary mode of existence. Now, part of the reason why I wanted to emphasize this element of Kierkegaard's thought is that this is, of course, an existential psychology, and consequently, most psychologists are very interested in things like developmental schemes, because there's a whole sector of psychology devoted to, well, what we call psychological development, and a lot of what you learn there is about different developmental schemes, like there's Freud's psychosexual scheme, and there's Erikson's psychosocial scheme, and there's Kohlberg's scheme with regard to morality and moral reasoning, and there's Piaget's scheme with regard to cognitive development. So this part of Kierkegaard's thought, I think, would be interesting to a lot of psychology students, so that's why we're going to go over it. So the question is, where do things start up? What's the most sort of basic default mode of existence? Well, for Kierkegaard, the basic default mode of existence, which incidentally is probably the mode of existence most of us are in, especially in the 21st century when we live, is called the aesthetic mode of existence. Now here, you need to sort of remember how that word was used in decades past and not how we tend to use it today. Okay, so the word aesthetic today, for the most part, refers to things like theories of beauty and art and artistic expression and that sort of thing. But aesthesis, right, the Greek root of the word, refers more to sensation. Okay, so he means it in that sense. So the aesthetic mode of existence is going to be driven for the most part by certain kinds of sensations. Well, what kinds of sensations? Well, primarily the sensations of pleasure and pain. Okay, so the aesthetic mode of existence is all about, if you're moving through life primarily in order to maximize your pleasure and minimize your pain, you're in what Kierkegaard would call the aesthetic mode of existence. And it doesn't really matter whether your pleasure that you're seeking is sort of crude and primitively hedonistic, like for instance, sort of a meth addiction perhaps, or a heroin addiction or something like that, or getting drunk all the time, or whether it's relatively sophisticated and elevated, like, oh, I don't know, like maybe your idea of seeking pleasure is to listen to Don Giovanni while sipping fine cognac or something like that. From the point of Kierkegaard's analysis, those are both basically the same thing, and the reason why is because they're both just governed by the principle of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And then probably, like I said, for most of us, it's maybe even hard to see what more there is to life beyond that, because it's the same principle that governs a lot of animal behaviors too. It's the same principle that runs throughout Skinnerian behavioral psychology. It's all about trying to get reinforcements and avoid punishments, if you're keen on that behavioristic type vocabulary. Okay, so the question at this point is, why would anyone step beyond that mode of existence, the pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding mode of existence? And the problem that Kierkegaard localizes in that mode of life has to do with the sensation of boredom. Okay, so boredom is going to be a big deal for the next few minutes. And maybe it's something, even if you're young, you might have noticed in life that, in an odd kind of way, the vast majority of life's pleasures can become boring sooner rather than later. And I remember learning this in high school when oh my goodness, like in high school, I loved, as most high school students at the time did, this is going to be a little dinosaur story, straight from the La Brea tar pits of my youth. So we loved Leonard Skinner's Freebird, the song Freebird by Leonard Skinner. And I remember one time there was a house party, I guess, down the street, and I was lying in bed, and they were playing that song over and over, and each time they played it, I was like in ecstasy listening to this song, Freebird, and all the intricate guitar lines and all of that, and thinking, I'll never fall out of love with this song. This is the best song, even better possibly than some material off of Led Zeppelin 4. Oh, I know, heresy, right? But yeah, so, well, after a while, a little funny thing started to happen. Like, yeah, I was in love with the song. Oh, it's the greatest song ever. A lot of kids thought that at the time in the late 70s. In fact, I even had tickets to see Leonard Skinner when their plane went down. And oh my goodness, when I heard that on the news, I was just devastated by that. But at any rate, okay, so after a while of hearing Leonard Skinner's Freebird, it still was good, but not quite as good. Then maybe 100 times later of listening to it, yeah, that's definitely good. And then like maybe 100 more times, it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, all right. Then 100 more times, it's sort of like, well, I guess, yeah. And then 100 more times, it's kind of like, yeah, maybe let's listen to something else. Okay, so where did that pleasure go? Well, it went where all pleasures ultimately go. Once you repeat them often enough, the pleasure somehow drains away from it. It's like, you're buying things that you want, like the same kind of thing in your participation commodity culture. It's like you really want something, and you earn money, and you think about it, and it'll be so good to have it. And then eventually you have it, and you're in ecstasy for a little while, and then, within a month, it's sort of like, well, there it is. It's there, and that's good, but yeah, where did all that pleasure go? Once again, it's where they all go. You repeat something often enough, you tend to get bored with it. Okay, so that's the problem with boredom. Now, here's the tempting thing to think, like when you get tired, let's say, of the song Freebird. I'm sorry it's such an old school example. Maybe I should talk about 2 Chainz or something, you know, like whatever your, or maybe Shostakovich. I don't know what your musical styles are. But let's say you sort of exhaust a song, the pleasure of a song, because you hear it too many times, and after it's like, oh, I don't even want to hear that song again after a while. Well, the tempting thing to think is like, I need a new song. I need a new song to replace that one and give me that sort of jolt of pleasure that, let's say, Freebird or whatever used to give you. And so you find another song and you drain the pleasure out of that one. Then you find another song and you drain the pleasure out of that one. Then eventually it occurs to you that, you know, what I'm really getting bored with is the whole activity of draining the pleasure out of each song that I find. Okay, and then looking for the next one. That whole activity is the thing that's boring me. And at that point, you may say to yourself, "Well, I need a new hobby, is what I need, like a whole new sort of activity." So let's pick out a new hobby for you. It's bowling. Okay, so your new hobby is no longer listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd, it's going bowling. So you end up doing a lot of bowling, and at first maybe it's like a lot of fun and you're getting a little bit better, and so your scores are getting higher, and you're sort of like getting into that and all of that kind of sensation, and you sort of, you know, get your own bowling ball and your own shoes, so you're not sort of renting the ones at the bowling alley. And but then after a while, it's like, well, yeah, bowling, yeah, that's all right. See, the same thing happens. And so then you think, well, I need a new hobby yet. Okay, so then maybe you exhaust a bunch of hobbies like that, all right? Then maybe eventually it dawns on you, the thing that's really boring me is the whole activity of exhausting each hobby, draining down the pleasure of it, looking for the next hobby, the next thing that's going to sort of fulfill your existence, and so on. So at that point, like if you reach that point, it's like, well, damn, I'm bored with the whole pattern of pleasure and pain. You're ready to move to a new mode of existence. Okay, you're ready to move to a new mode of existence. Now, for Kierkegaard, what the next mode of existence is called is going to be the ethical mode of existence. Okay, so aesthetic mode of existence, pain and pleasure. What you're obeying is pain and pleasure, sort of at the bottom. The next mode up, if you happen to get sort of bored enough, and I said in your notes, maybe ennui is a better term. It's a French word that's been appropriated into English. Ennui means sort of like bored beyond boredom, in a sense. You're like sort of super or hyper bored or something like that, you know. So if you reach that point, you may be ready for a new pattern of existence. Okay, so the next pattern of existence is going to be the ethical pattern of existence. So instead of obeying pain and pleasure, what you're going to be obeying is the dictates of secular ethics. Okay, and since I use the word secular, you might be able to sort of infer what the third pattern of existence is going to be about. But for now, let's focus on the ethical mode. So, obeying the dictates of secular ethics. Basically, it's this: doing what's right, not necessarily because it brings you pleasure, but because it's right. Okay, so it's a duty ethics, right? It's not a pleasure-driven ethics, like trying to optimize your own or other people's happiness or something like that, because that would still be the aesthetic mode of existence, still governed by the search for pleasure. The other thing you have to sort of tease apart at this point is if you're doing what's right because you're hoping to accrue some advantage for yourself that ultimately you think will bring you pleasure or make you happier or something like that, doesn't count as the ethical mode of existence. Why? Because like if ultimately the reason why you're doing what you're doing, even if at one level of description you're doing the right thing, if the governing principle is you're trying to optimize pleasure somehow, then really what's going on is the aesthetic mode, not the ethical mode. So it's a lot harder to find examples of the ethical mode of existence in our world because so much of our world is oriented around trying to make ourselves happier somehow, which of course is the aesthetic mode of existence. So in your notes, I gave you an example. Let's see, I gave you an example about sometimes people will join the military or the Peace Corps or some organization like that, not so much because they're trying to optimize their own happiness, but because they just think it's the right thing to do. But I think a better example, maybe one that's not quite so relevant to your young lives if you're 20 years old, would be being a parent. Okay, I think that's a much better example than the one I gave you in the notes. So here's the thing about being a parent. If you're a parent in the genuine sense, and not everyone is, okay, then what matters is doing right by your kids. That's first and foremost. Whether you're experiencing pleasure or not, that gets demoted, okay? Because the main thing in life is doing right by your kids for sure. And why are you doing right by your kids? Because it's the right thing to do. And whether you feel pleasure or not is a very secondary consideration if it's in the picture at all. And there are very, very many unpleasant tasks that are not pleasure-giving associated with being a parent. Now, when I said that not everyone is a parent in the genuine sense, some people are biological parents, but it's still all about them. You getting it? If it's still all about you and your pleasure and your happiness, you haven't moved beyond the aesthetic mode of existence. You're doing sort of the same thing that rats and roaches do. Sort of combine those into the ratchet combination of rat and roach. That's a portmanteau word. Okay, so let's improve your vocabulary. Portmanteau word is a word that's sort of, you take two words and sort of jam them together, and that's a portmanteau or a portmanteau word. All right, so okay, so you have to find experiences like that to be able to relate to the ethical mode of existence. So it's being a parent in a certain kind of way. If you're the kind of parent where it's all about your kids, it's all about doing right by your kids, irrespective of how much pain it costs you, you're in the ethical mode of existence. You've left the aesthetic mode of existence behind, you know, so it's a kind of duty ethics. All right, so now, the third mode, and I kind of gave you a spoiler because when I said, well, the ethical mode is about obeying the dictates of secular ethics. The third mode is going to be the religious mode, in contrast to the secular nature of the ethical mode. Okay, so the religious mode of existence, you could kind of see this coming because in the last video I said, well, you know, Kierkegaard is extremely... It's hard even to overestimate how religiously enthusiastic he is, especially in a Christian Protestant vein, more specifically. So the religious mode of existence is going to be the uppermost way of being alive. And the reason why is because there's more to life than just doing right, okay? Because, you know, doing right, there can be a robotic way of doing that, you know, where it's just, well, I just follow the law all the time, you know. So, yeah, so no matter what the law says, you're going to do it. So if you're in Nazi Germany and the law says you need to work on this train that's going to drive the Jews over here to this camp, you got to do it. It's like, well, more to life than that, okay? So, and anyhow, for Kierkegaard, the real answer to the riddle of life has to issue from sort of the deepest regions of possibility. You can't just sort of stop with sort of a second-rate answer and say, well, you've arrived. It's like the deepest mode of existence is going to be the one motivated by the furthest, deepest, most powerful possibilities of human existence. And for him, those kinds of possibilities are made manifest and real for the most part in the religious mode of life, where, okay, ethical, the aesthetic mode of existence, it's about obeying pain and pleasure. Ethical mode of existence, it's about obeying the dictates of secular ethics. Religious mode of existence, it's about obeying God. Okay, so going to drop some G-bombs on you. That's God, by the way. Okay, so obedience to God in this case. Now, the thing about obedience to God is this, that obedience to God can be pretty easy as long as what God is telling you and what secular ethics are telling you are the same thing. Okay? And there's no sort of opportunity to debate whether you're doing the right thing or not. Okay? So there's not tension. What differentiates the religious mode of existence is, besides obedience to God, is when your obedience to God would supersede what secular ethics would tell you. Okay? In other words, what God is telling you is very different from what secular ethics would be telling you. Okay, so how might that happen? Well, there's a couple places in the Bible where this happens. Let's see. First one is in Genesis 22, I believe. Genesis 22. Okay, so in case you don't remember that, that's the story of Abraham and Isaac. And Kierkegaard is fascinated with the story. It appears again and again in his works. So in case you don't remember this, let's sort of, refresh your memory about Genesis. That is Genesis 22. Yeah. So I just had to sort of scan through it in my mind. Okay, so Abraham, the great patriarch, Abraham is commanded by God to take his son Isaac up to Mount Moriah to make a sacrifice, a human sacrifice out of his own son. And he has another son, but it's sort of like by way of a concubine. God, those were the days, weren't they, when you could have like concubines? But anyhow, okay, so don't joke around. I know I got my dad joke shirt on, but even so, not too many biblical jokes. Okay, so he takes his only legitimate son, let's say that, up to the top of this mountain to make a human sacrifice out of his son. It's a little bit comical because Isaac, the son, is he's asking Abraham, like, where's the ram for the burnt offering, for the sacrifice? Like, where's the ram? Like, why don't we have a ram? And Abraham sort of fobs him off a little bit. It's sort of, well, the Lord will provide. I don't know. Maybe that's my morbid sense of humor. Maybe you don't find that funny. I find it a little bit funny. Like, where's the ram, Dad, for the burnt offering? But at any rate, Abraham takes his son up. He prepares him for the human sacrifice and is raising the blade to do this when all of a sudden he's stopped in the nick of time, basically by an angel. Okay. God sends an angel down to stop him. So what's the point? The point is that for Kierkegaard, this is an incredibly important story because it illustrates how Abraham's faith was so great that he was able to let his obedience to God supersede almost the most powerful ethical secular mandate you can imagine, not to kill your own kids. It's hard to sort of out-trump that one. And he was willing to, let God call the shots with the faith that, God would eventually sort everything out and it would all be okay. So he was willing to sort of even go down that deep, transgressive path in the service of his relation to God. So he's the great exemplar of the religious mode of existence. Why? Because he engaged that tension where what God would tell him came into direct conflict with what secular ethics would tell him, and yet he did not defer to secular ethics, he deferred to God. Okay? So Abraham is the hero, in a sense, and the great exemplar of the religious mode of existence. Now, entering into that kind of faith in God, and consequently into the religious mode of existence, Kierkegaard gives a special fancy name to, and it's in big block letters in your notes, and it's the teleological suspension of the ethical. Whoa, there's a mouthful. The teleological suspension of the ethical. All right, so, and it may seem like, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to remember that? Well, actually, if you sort of break the phrase apart, it sort of makes sense and describe what's going on. So it's a suspension of the mandates of secular ethics in the service of a greater telos. What's a telos? A telos is a greater goal or destination. Okay, so you're suspending your obedience to secular ethics in the service of a deeper telos. And what's the deeper telos? Obedience to God. Okay, so the movement from the ethical mode of existence to the religious mode is marked by this teleological suspension of the ethical. It's also marked by the experience of faith as a subjective truth. Slowing down on that to give you a second to remember what that's about. Like a deep individual experience of, well, in this case, what the meaning of faith is. Now, what does faith mean? Well, here's Kierkegaard's take on the experience of faith, religious faith, is that it's not just an objective truth to have faith. Okay, so it's not a product of a certain accumulation of empirical observations and or logical abstract inferences. It's not about any of that. Okay, it's about a certain kind of experience, and the certain kind of experience is going to be very related to doubt. Okay, so this is a way of contradicting people who think that, well, you know, faith is about knowing, let's say, that God exists. And for Kierkegaard, that's like a complete counterfeit of real faith. And the reason why is because, well, you can probably figure out the reason why, because it's a way of pinning your faith on to something like an objective truth, but that's not the nature of faith at all. Faith is what it is by virtue of it being one of those kind of experiences that you have to have yourself for it to count as a truth at all. So it's not just a matter of knowing, because knowing is part and parcel of the objective view of truth, not the subjective view of truth. So for him, people that claim that they just sort of know that God exists or something like that, or that Jesus, the blood of the Lamb, is the way to salvation, they just sort of know it. Like for Kierkegaard, that's like, you're fooling yourself. Like you've been duped in a way, like you're accepting a counterfeit vision of what faith actually is, because faith is in an intimate relation to what you can easily doubt. All right? And as a consequence, it's something that takes over when the outer limits of objective evidence and objective logical argumentation have reached their outermost limit. All right, so it's a kind of subjective truth. It's sort of like, once again, the example I brought up in the last video, like Louis Armstrong. Like if you have to ask what jazz is, you won't understand the answer. Similar kind of deal. Like if you have to ask what Christian faith is from his point of view, you won't understand the answer, because you don't have enough experiential basis for understanding the answer. So no amount of words will bring you into a genuine understanding of what faith is about unless you have some kind of measure of personal experience to lend it sense and power and so on. So this is what differentiates also a fanatic, like a religious fanatic or zealot, from what he calls a knight of faith. Okay, a knight, not a knight with an N, a K-N-I-G-H-T, of faith. All right, so a knight of faith is one whose faith exists in relation to doubt. All right, and that's an enhancement of faith. Right, so if you say that your faith, well, I just know, that's not faith in any genuine sense at all, from his point of view. Okay, that means you're a fanatic if you claim you just know. Right? It's still like your so-called faith is really just a misrecognition of the very nature of faith in the first place. All right, so faith, another sort of way of describing it as a kind of subjective experience, is by virtue of the absurd. And at first that seems like, oh, like Kierkegaard sort of dissing faith. That's not it at all. Like, it's a way of talking about what I just described, that faith is the kind of subjective truth that takes over beyond the outer reaches of everything that is objectively affirmable. So in a way, faith is in alignment with the absurd. So the absurd is not a way of diminishing the power of faith or the value of faith. It's a way of, in fact, it's a way of describing it that enhances it. Like, yeah, faith is more powerful than any sort of empirical observation or any sort of complex set of logical argumentations. Like, and I gave you an example of some of those logical argumentations. Saint Anselm, I think I might have mentioned him in one of your earlier videos, like was a famous, provided the most famous logical argument for the existence of God in the medieval period. So it's sort of a tricky argument, and I'm debating whether I should tell you what it is. No, that's too much detail. This video is probably getting long enough already. So, but let's just leave it at this. Like, those are fun and games, like logically trying to prove the existence of God or point to a set of empirical observations that somehow will convince you that God exists. That's not the point at all. That's a way of mistaking objective truth for subjective truth. Faith and becoming a knight of faith is irreducibly a kind of subjective truth. Like, you have to experience it. You have to experience communion with God ultimately, or with the ultimate in some sense, in order for this to make any sense at all. And so all those kinds of proofs are fundamentally misdirections. So let's see how I said it in your notes. Faith is grounded in a very personal, very decisive, committed, passionate experience of God. It involves leaping beyond the prevailing social attitudes, ideas, and beliefs about God. Okay, so because faith is a kind of subjective truth, and here's where Kierkegaard can easily start pissing people off. It's not a matter of whether you adhere to social conventions about God. All right, so it's not about whether you dress up for church. You know, it's not about whether you go to bingo. All right, it's not about you know, saying grace at every meal or anything like that. You know, it's so all these sorts of social conventions and sort of seemingly external markers of Christian faith may or may not reflect a genuine Christian relation to God. Okay, so in fact, you know, you can easily go through all the motions and be missing the core experiential nature of relating to God. It's just that, well, you know, you do it because maybe you think that, you know, that's how you grew up, or that's what your parents told you was the right thing, or that's what the larger society told you was the right thing. Like for Kierkegaard, this is all misdirection. This is all a mistake. Like if that's what you think religious life is about, is just sort of, you know, copying the people around you or copying the larger society, and, you know, it's not about this sort of very intense personal experiential, subjective kind of truth. It's like you're missing the whole core of it. And he has a kind of critique of what he calls Christendom, sarcastically, or the Christian mob, he sometimes puts it. It's like people who have all the trappings of Christianity are missing the core experiential center of it. Like it's a complete, you know, in a way the devil would have no better allies than people that do that. You know, the devil could gain no greater satisfaction than by witnessing people going through all the damn motions and missing the boat entirely. You know. Okay, so this is a way of irritating probably a lot of people, because, you know, probably a lot of us think, well, you know, as long as I'm sort of saying the right things and I can quote scripture and, you know, do the right things and say the right things at the right time and engage in the right sort of Skinnerian behaviors, it's like, well, I guess I must be a genuine Christian. And he's saying, like, actually, you're fooling yourself. All right, so... Okay, so last thing I sort of have for you on this part of Kierkegaard, I want to talk about another part of Kierkegaard in the next video. I've summarized in your notes all of this stuff in terms of a diagram that hopefully you can see right next to me. So starting with the aesthetic mode of existence, okay, the one governed by pain and pleasure, moving through a transition born out of a kind of ennui, to the ethical mode of existence, which is about doing what's right because it's right, basically obeying the dictates of secular ethics, moving from that to a kind of leap of faith, by virtue of the absurd, into a kind of teleological suspension of the ethical, and thereby beginning a genuinely religious, God-centered relation to existence. So, and probably at this point you're getting a much greater sense for what I said in the beginning, that Kierkegaard is very religious, very religious. In fact, you might even think of him more as a theologian. It's possible to think of him more as a theologian than a philosopher as such, but he's usually regarded as a philosopher. But you could make that argument, really. Okay, all the way up to the religious mode of existence, which is about obedience to God and experiencing God as a kind of subjective truth. All right, so that's probably enough for this video. In the next video, we're going to be talking about dread. So the next video is also going to be very Kierkegaardian. And then after that, I want to talk about another thing that Rollo May mentions, which is this correspondence between existential thinking and Eastern thinking. And then I'd like to reconnect with the Rollo May book. So you have a little bit of time to catch up on your reading assignment. Until then, Have a good one. I hope you enjoy the day. I'm looking out the window. Looks a little cloudy, but who knows what'll happen. At any rate, take care. Bye-bye.